So I am going to talk about some photographers that have used depth of field in what I think is a pretty interesting way. And this can be inspiring for you. There can be some takeaways that you really enjoy, and maybe something resonates with you. Right? So a lot of photographers are really good about protecting their images, and so I'm just going to go to some websites that their websites. They'll get all the credit that way, and I'm gonna jump to a couple of images that really speak to how they figured out depth of field and how they can make it work for them. Okay. So I'm going to go to Deborah Bloomfield's website, and I'm going to go through these images, and I'm going to get us to, no, these are good images to talk about actually. So in this image, the photographer has focused on just the window and the moisture that's on the window, and the mountains and whatever is off in the distance is completely out of focus, okay? So there's a couple of things that contribute to depth of field, all right? So you might have noticed, if you've ever looked through binoculars, that when you focus on something kind of close to you, uh, everything off in the distance is completely blurry. And it's because you're using a pretty long lens. You're looking really far away, right? So most of you have zoom lenses. It could be maybe 24 millimeters wide all the way up to like 105 or 120 or maybe just 70. 70 or so is actually a pretty long lens. So when you're playing with depth of field, adjust the lens to be really long, like really zoom in on it, okay? And see the difference between zoomed in on an image and then zoomed all the way back, all right? So one thing that contributes to depth of field is the length of the lens, the millimeters of the length of the lens. The other thing that contributes to it is the aperture, which we've just talked about. The lower the number, the wider the aperture, and it might get confusing at first, and don't worry, you'll figure it out. The smaller the number, like 2.8, the wider the aperture is actually going to be, and it's going to let in more light. And what that does is it creates a shallower depth of field. Okay? So the smaller the number, the shallower the depth of field. The bigger the number, like f22, where the aperture gets really small, the greater the depth of field. It extends, okay? You get used to it a little bit more as you go along. So what's interesting about this is there's an image that Deborah has shot that I always love looking at when I think about depth of field. I also really like looking at her photographs because they're luscious wilderness. This project's called Wilderness. These two photographs, okay? So there's this photograph and there's this photograph. What's the difference between these two photographs? Depth of field. If you look at this first photograph, you see that there's focus kind of right up in the front of these trees, and everything in the background is out of focus. If I go to the next image, everything's in focus. We start to see the detail of the trees off in the distance. The only difference between these two images is the aperture. This one has a wider aperture, probably 2.8, and this one has a greater aperture, or depth of field, excuse me, probably f11 or f16, okay? When you adjust the aperture in a situation like this, because it's the same exposure, right? So you'd think that, let's say it was 1/250th of a second, and, or excuse me, let's say it was like 1/500th of a second, and you're opened up to f2.8 to make this photograph. If you adjust the aperture to f11, which means you're making the hole smaller, you're letting in less light, what are you going to have to do? You're going to have to compensate with the shutter speed to let in the same amount of light, right? Okay, so you get to this image and it's the same exposure, but with more depth of field, which means that if she started at f2.8 at 1/500th for the other image and went to f11, that would have meant that that's 2.8 to 4, 5.6, f8, f11. That's 5 stops difference in aperture that she would have had to compensate with 5 stops difference in shutter speed. So if she was at 500th of a second for the other one and made it 5 stops darker to compensate with shutter speed, she would have gone from 1/500th of a second to 2/50th of a second to 1/25th of a second to 1/60th of a second to 1/30th of a second to 1/15th of a second to be able to get the same exposure. Okay? If that's confusing, then you're paying attention because it's complicated. It takes a minute to get used to, but what you're going to start to realize is you'll make an adjustment on one thing, and it means you have to make an adjustment on something else. All right? Uta, I showed Uta's work the other day. These images are taken out of Uta's home, and here we have a shallow depth of field. We have the focus on these window panes. Most of the image is out of focus and outside. It's an abstracted interpretation of the outside world, while we're looking at not only the panes of glass that we can barely see, but also this dark framing that kind of borders the image. So they're interesting images, I think, because of these reasons. It's a play on color, and it's a play with space to be able to adjust your aperture and how close you are to something to make depth of field actually do something interesting and work for you. All right, and play with shutter speed. How long are you moving the camera around? Are you still able to see what's happening in the image? Okay. Vivian Maier. Talked about Vivian Maier. Vivian Maier has done some really interesting stuff with depth of field. Let's just go to Street 1. Everything's in focus. Everything's in focus. Here, we're closer to something. We're closer to this guy, and so he's in focus, but the rest is a little out of focus. So you can see where the depth of field kind of goes. You can start to look in an image and say, oh, there's about like 8 or 10 feet of depth of field. Here, she's really close to this person, and you can also tell that there's a little motion blur from the wings of the pigeons. So there must be maybe, it could be 125th of a second, it could be a 60th of a second. You'll start to notice that 125th of a second will freeze the world if the world's not moving too quick. And if the world starts to jump around or flap around, then you might need to either embrace that and play with that motion, or you might need to bring your shutter speed up, and then you're going to have to open your aperture up, or you're going to have to make some adjustments depending on the exposure. Everything's in focus. Even Empire State Building off in the distance, right? So this means it's daylight. You've got the aperture set to something like f11, and depending on where you're focusing at, you've got a wide depth of field. Everything's in focus, even seemingly these cars that are up close. The building off in the distance, everything's in focus. Changes the image, right? It changes the space. All right, that's Vivian Maier. Alex Soth uses a large format camera. This is Sleeping by the Mississippi. This is one of his most famous images. I'm probably only going to show this image from his body of work right now, but this shows how when you embrace the shallow depth of field, you can really make your subject pop and be present in front of whatever the background is. That hummingbird picture I showed wasn't really, it's interesting because you get to see a hummingbird's wings completely frozen. But the background was just kind of blotchy color. It wasn't just pure white. It wasn't just some blank canvas. In this image, we get to see the environment. We get to see the home. We get to see the land. We get to see the climate. We get to see all sorts of things. It tells us more about this figure than if it was just an isolated portrait of his head or something, and that would have given us less information. Here, the mystery is pushed because we've got so much more context. Sugimoto, brilliant photographer. Brilliant photographer. These are actually the Twin Towers. He does this thing called double infinity, where you get to infinity and you can't usually focus any more than that. And what he's done is he's made it so his camera goes twice that far, so absolutely nothing is in focus. But he's managed to make the images look really interesting. You can still tell what's in the image. You can still take the image and sort of land, but nothing is sharp, and it's just kind of ethereal and maybe a little dreamlike, you know. This image, what is this image? We know what this image is, but it's doing this entirely different thing. We're thinking about texture and tones and, you know, it's almost motion, but it's just an out of focus image that has been done with a lot of intention. So I like looking at Sugimoto's work for sure. So the assignment for depth of field, and this you'll find in Blackboard, is what I want you to do is figure out a way to have shallow depth of field, a wide depth of field, everything in focus, an image with nothing in focus, you know, like Sugimoto. You have to really figure out how your camera works to be able to get nothing in focus. You might find that autofocus is overpowering and you need to switch it to manual focus, all right? And then one image representing depth of field, your choice, okay? So that could be whatever you want. Again, I never like to tell people what to photograph. I just want to show you that you can photograph everything, and these are some examples that I think are, you know, worth looking at and being inspired by. So at the end of it, these are the three things that we're going to be thinking about: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. We've got aperture, which is the amount of light being let in, and what will, of these three options, decide depth of field. We have shutter speed, which is how long the light's being let in, which will ultimately decide motion blur. And then we have ISO, which will ultimately decide the graininess of the image. This is a famous photo by Daido Moriyama, who embraced the graininess of the film. So he's shooting with this film, it's high speed, there's high contrast, it's gritty, and then we've got somebody who uses a large format with a very low ISO, so we have perfectly smooth detail. Here again, super large format film with a very smooth grain, ISO 100 probably, right? So that's shutter speed, that's depth of field, and that's ISO. These are the things that will contribute to every single photograph that we make. I hope this has been helpful. This is a crash course. Again, watch it twice if you need to, but the most important thing is you start taking pictures. Get up close to something, back away from something, go to a smaller aperture, go to a wider aperture, just, you know, explore the camera, because that's what photography is, exploring the world.